Hello, how are you today? Welcome to our midsummer sermon at Maisons-Laffitte. It's the 4th of August, and we are truly in the middle of summer, middle of the Olympics as well. Charlotte and I are here, so if there's anything on your mind you'd love to chat about, please do get in touch. One of us at least is available at all times throughout the summer. For today, let's turn our thoughts to one of the Bible passages from the lectionary reading. It's in 2 Samuel, starting at in chapter 11, verse 26, and going through 12:13. Now, if you can pause and read the whole of 2 Samuel 12, it's well worth having open in front of you. If, however, you're listening while driving, for example, as I have a tendency to do, then perhaps simply call to mind the moment when God sends the prophet Nathan to confront David about his multiple sins. If you'd like to catch up on the story so far, you could pause this talk and listen to last week's sermon. It's the one called When Giving Up Sounds Tempting. Well, anyways, I was saying we're about halfway through the 2 weeks of the Olympics, and personally, I find it's been far more compelling and captivating than I'd expected. Over a year ago, my husband got us all tickets to a morning of athletics, which I'm really looking forward to. But because I don't know that much about it, I have been watching some of the track and field events on the telly with probably more attention than usual, especially the running. And I remember the fact that the Apostle Paul uses both boxing and running as metaphors for the Christian life. And he does this a number of times, up to maybe 6 of his epistles, if I've counted correctly. He talks about running with endurance, running or boxing with focus, and a couple times about finishing well, running in order to win the prize. All sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Especially if you've been listening to the Olympics commentators and how they talk about how athletes have prepared. I am amazed by the detail and refinement that now goes into optimizing every athlete's performance, their diet, their technique, every training action seems to be scrutinized on video clips, starts, hurdles, flip turns, whatever it is, crossing the finish line. Even the hundreds of times they fail, or maybe especially the hundreds of times they fall. It's all fair game for discussion. After all, I suppose, if they don't know where they went wrong, how will they know how to do better? So they learn to study their past performance. They learn to want to find and name the slightest mistake so that the next time they can do better. I find this both incredibly inspiring and also completely intimidating as a metaphor for life. I don't know about you. And yet the Bible, sometimes I feel a certain amount of compassion for the people described, especially in those historical books within the Old Testament. Reading those stories is kind of like watching the video replay of somebody else's life gone wrong. Now, this is immensely helpful for us because by studying their mistakes, we have some chance of saving ourselves at least some of the pain of repeating their errors. And unfortunately, we're in one of the best all-time sort of things to learn from a terrible series of events. Reviewing somebody else's actions is one thing, but it can be so hard to see one's own actions objectively, can't it? In chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, King David has completely failed to identify where he was off track. So the prophet Nathan comes along in chapter 12 with what is essentially a playback of David's actions, but we could kind of imagine it with the faces blurred, the wallpaper background on the screen changed for anonymity. Nathan then cleverly asks David to sit as judge, that was his role as king, on a case of misappropriation and murder. Well, Judge David's verdict is unflinching. This man deserves to die. He must pay back the wrong he has done. Oh my goodness, it is so easy to pass judgment and sentencing when we think we're talking about someone else, isn't it? In some ways, Nathan's also giving David one last chance to recognize himself. You know, he's waiting for his conscience to do its quiet role, for the penny to drop for David, for him to heed that sense of God's discreet, behind-the-scenes conviction. It never happens. Self-righteously, indignantly, he condemns and sentences that anonymous rich man to the full extent of the law. Only then does Nathan reveal what's going on, like a sudden unblurring of the faces, a restoring of the real-life screen. Nathan delivers the verdict from God, who has seen every one of David's unrepentant thoughts and actions. You are the man. What this verdict has, and the consequences have, several parts. Yes, David won't die, mercy. But his first son with Bathsheba will. And then, devastatingly, God will also allow all the natural consequences for David's actions to unfold. Let me explain what I mean. From chapters 13 to 19, there is a heart-chilling description of what happens when a leader's sinful behaviors are imitated by others. In chapter 13, one of David's sons, his firstborn, decides that he, like his father, hey, why not? Well, he can take for himself a female who's not his wife. In this case, it's Amnon's teenage half-sister whom he rapes, having first ensured, very cleverly, the complicity of his doting father, King David. Well, when this doting father, David, learns of the rape, he doesn't act as the objective judge that he was in the case of Nathan's metaphorical selfish rich man with the sheep. No. He chooses to protect himself and not punish his son. In other words, David has not learned the lesson he should have learned from reviewing that clip of his life involving Bathsheba and Uriah. Instead, verse 21 says, when King David heard of all these things, meaning the rape, he became very angry, but would not punish his son Amnon, because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. Oh, this is not a formative, godly love. On the contrary, David's so-called love here is a weak, selfish thing, unrefined by justice or love for his daughter. And because David fails to require justice for his daughter, the direct consequence in verse 22 is that another of David's sons, Absalom, burns with unresolved hatred against the unpunished brother. And then the next ripple is that Absalom's hatred for his brother and his resentment of his father for failing to act, well, they grow and they fester. And Absalom embarks on a decade-long campaign to overthrow his father. This finally culminates in a civil war involving every possible atrocity, including 20,000 Israelites dying in one single day. Absalom is finally killed about 11 or 12 years after the unpunished rape of his sister, and the country slowly, painfully rebuilds. I never realized until I was doing trauma care in war-torn countries the extent to which one leader's persistent blindness to his own serious character flaw could damage a whole community. When I would offer post-conflict training, I used, and I imagine Open Doors trauma care workers still use, these 10 chapters for local church leaders. We would take almost a whole week and use them like coaches using video clips for athletes, because to many of our brothers and sisters in the faith, these chapters read like current events. David's lack of compassion for the victim, his refusal to self-interrogate, his rejection of personal responsibility, and finally his refusal to speak justice because of personal bias. These crucial decisions still face leaders today, and the consequences of choices still ripple across entire nations. Please be assured, I do preach on these chapters with fear and trembling. I measure what they mean. I feel it in my own heart, because if we're really brave, we can start to see parallels with any church leader failing to stand up for the most vulnerable, failing to remain humble before God. For any mature Christian, any one of us, failing to humbly learn from our own mistakes. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can choose, with God's help, not to be a David, blind to our own sin, not to be an Amnon, repeating our father's sins, not to be an Absalom, eaten from the outside to destruction by an injustice suffered. God has given us these chapters to study and learn from, and we can grow the courage, develop the courage to review our own lives in the company of the ever honest, but also ever so gentle and merciful Holy Spirit. God is always waiting to lift from us burdens we cannot carry, whether it be the burden of our own sins or the burden of suffering from the sins of others. For me, from the Olympics so far, one of the most enduring images was seeing what one Chinese gymnast did when she fell off the balance beam mid-routine. We might imagine that it was a humiliating fall, but she got back up and then stood stock still by the beam for a really uncomfortable, maybe 5 or 10 seconds, while we all held our breath. And then she lifted herself back up onto the beam, continued her piece, finishing well with a perfect dismount. In our Christian faith, no matter how many times or how embarrassingly we or others fall, each and every time, God invites us to choose to humbly still ourselves before Him, and then, covered by His love and in His strength, to give it another go, to carry on, to do whatever we can to finish well. Blessings on your week, everyone.